Hello, I am doing a video for a friend of mine that's starting watercolor, and so I kind of want to give the philosophy behind watercolor, uh, as well as basically the different kinds of techniques to use. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but that'll give you a good idea. So when I first started watercolor, I hated it. Absolutely hated the medium. It was incredibly uncontrollable and difficult to handle. And it took me a long time to figure out what was the most important thing. And basically watercolor isn't a medium that, like everything else, that you can control 100%. Oil you can control, acrylics you can control. I mean, pretty much any other medium paint that I have used personally, for me, I could control at least a very large percentage of it, where it seemed like I could control everything. Well, with watercolor, it's different. So here's the deal. You got to kind of shift your kind of perspective on how you approach it, and approach it as that the watercolor itself is a living entity, because you're dealing with the water. Water is its life. Water is its white. Water is what makes it flow, that kind of stuff. So what you have to concentrate on more is creating the environment so that it can live in particular ways. And even then, you don't have complete control over it. But if you learn to create the environment of both the paper and the brush, then things are going to go a lot smoother. So first of all, what I wanted to go over is the paper. And I have learned the hard way, and I can't tell you how many experts have said the same thing, because I didn't believe what they said either, and tried it on my own. Is, you know, you can have cheap paints and you can have cheap brushes, but if you have cheap paper, you will never get a watercolor look. Just it will wear out. You can't use it in its proper form. The paper is everything. Now, do I believe you need to have good paints? Heck yeah. I mean, but you can do watercolor with cheap paints. It just won't have as much pigment in it. So the color may be definitely not as rich or as has depth or anything like that. So anyway, I wanted to go over some paper. This particular paper is hot press, and you can tell that there is no grain. It doesn't look like there's any kind of bumpy grain at all. And it's the way it's processed. Now, this hot press paper, particular hot press paper, is 100% cotton. All right. And this is 100% cotton, and it's cold press. And now you can see that cold press has much more of a bumpy grain. This is actually a little more porous, so that it spreads differently. Sorry about that. So it spreads differently than the hot press. The hot press, it pretty much, oh my gosh. The hot press pretty much stays on the surface. I mean, it does absorb. Don't get me wrong. It is cotton. Anyway, it just behaves a little bit differently. This bumpy one is more of a traditional watercolor look. Now this particular one is a paper, watercolor paper. And now don't know if you can see it on the sides. It's not very durable. I mean, it's a good thick one. It's the same thickness as these, 140 pound, but it's not very durable, and there's only so much you can do with it. It doesn't travel the same. So behavior is going to be basically, I don't know, it's very hard to explain, but experiment with it yourself if you like, but no matter what, get a good paper. I mean, you can buy huge sheets of like Arches 100% cotton. It's like $10 for one sheet, but it's huge, and you can fold it back and forth and tear it so that it has a really neat edge. And you could do that like and have 16 sheets out of one piece of paper if you want, that are larger than this. So I'm trying to see if I have something here on hand that it would even be larger than this for the 16 sheets. But so it's definitely worth it. The only problem with that is you got to go to a store to get it. You got to go to a store like Blick's or the University Art Store, whatever art stores in your area, because they don't ship well. They're huge. I mean, it's like pretty big. So a lot of the other solution is a pad, and they come in at like 15 to 20 sheets per pad, and you just kind of cut the gum around it and lift the pad up, and lift the piece of paper up, and there you go. So another brand that I really truly recommend that is 100% cotton without paying the brand cost of Arches is Stonehenge by Cheap Joe's, and it's cheapjoes.com. And this is Stonehenge. This is a 300 pound. It's actually a sample, but for this video, it was like, oh, this is perfect. And this is also Stonehenge. It's 100% cotton, but without having to pay the price of the name. So it's beautiful. It's everything that Arches is, but it's just it's a different brand. So there we go. The whole boring stuff, right? But it's actually the most critical. So there are different ways to use watercolor. And these are very small pieces of paper for the demonstration, so it won't, this isn't my normal setup here, but for demo purposes, in front of the only camera I have, we'll make do. So anyway, the whole first thing, the one thing that is amazing about the 100% cotton paper is that you could actually take this whole glass of water and pour it on this paper, and it will be totally perfectly 100% fine. I mean, it's cotton after all, right? So now the differences between hot press and cold press would be, there's some technique differences because this is not quite as porous as this. However, it still recovers and works just as fine. There's not even a problem. If you're doing something with a lot of detail, hot press is the way to go. If you're doing a little more loose kind of painting, then I suggest the cold press for sure, because of the technique difference. Now, I have done incredibly detailed paintings on cold press, and it's just a little more challenging because of the rough nature. But as far as the water is concerned, you can still do the same things. This is a little less durable. The hot press is a little less durable, but the cold press is phenomenal as far as durability and lifting and that kind of stuff. So without further ado, we're going to start with talking about, let's see here. Let's get this something appropriate to size. Talking about techniques. Now, it is so incredibly rare that I would never wet my brush. And you'll need a tissue. I have a lot of times I'll use a sponge to have wet sponge nearby to actually dab extra stuff, paint or water or whatever, off my brush or whatever. But it's ultra rare that I would just go straight to a tube. In fact, I won't say 100%, I would never do that, but I'll say 99.999% of the time, I would never take something out of a tube straight on the a dry brush and put it on paper. It's not watercolor. Watercolor isn't about that. So the environment, like I said, the brush, water is life. Water is its life. Water is the white. So you're using the paper as the white paint. In traditional watercolor, white was never used. It was the paper that made the white. In order for that to happen, you need to avoid areas or have it more watery so it's lighter in color to let the lightness shine through. So that's the first thing. Now, the other thing is this particular thing is the paper here right now is dry, right? So we're going to be doing what we call wet on dry. And so I'm going to go to a palette here. We'll use a deep purple here, Windsor Violet. And we're going to go see how smooth this goes on. All right. And on cold press, I'm not sure you can actually see this. It's going blurry on me. My camera's trying to autofocus, and it's not working. So, oh wow, this might not turn out as good as I thought. I'm sorry, guys. I should have left well enough alone. All right. So anyway, I'm not sure you can tell, but this has more spaces in it than this. It's really smooth. It looks like a magic marker did it. So now here's the cool thing is watercolor isn't necessarily done with this. If you want, you can, again, it's environment. So you can now, if you want, you can actually put water near it. Let me clean my brush out and drop it on. And like I said, it doesn't run as much on hot press. So now we'll do the same thing on the cold press. And because it's gone into the paper more, because it's more porous, It's not just sitting on top. So you're going to get a different effect. And it's more of a traditional watercolor effect. And I'm sorry that you can't see it as well. But, and a lot of times you need to wait until it's dry before you can see its full effect. So you can also drop like water right in the middle of it and it will do some funky business. And you can see already, God, you can't on the camera. Well, let's hope. Let's hope that this turns out better in the finished recording than it looks on this camera on my version of it. So right here you kind of see a starburst, and so it behaves much differently. If you use a light color, this is Indian yellow here. You can make it merge, and it will, if it's still wet, it will mix together and make an exchange. So again, it's not going to travel near as far with the wet on dry. So you can pretty much control it more, but there's hard edges. And you can start to see now when you just throw a drop of water on it, what kind of behaviors can happen. And most of the time you don't want this effect, but you know, there are times when you do. I mean, where there's lighter areas in the middle here, and then on the very edges you'll have color, and so it's all about the effect that you want. So there's even edges here on the lighter colors. Now, wet on wet. So just to make things quick, I am going to I am letting it drip on here, and making it wet. Now it will absorb, and you even need to take the air humidity in consideration, because if it's dry, it is going to evaporate so much faster than if there's moisture in the air. So there we go. So douse it good. Now this isn't about how to stretch your paper or anything, and I do not use tape around the edges because it ends up buckling, and then you've got puddles and ripples, and I just don't do it. So this is 300 GSM. Normally I would wet the back and push it down on my palette, and then wet the front and let it absorb all the water, and so that it doesn't buckle while I'm painting, and there's no ripples for the water to run into the crevices and all that kind of stuff. So the thing is what's important is you get it wet, and depending on how wet you have it is what kind of behavior is going to happen. So if it's really wet like it is now, let's pick another color here. We'll use, just for the heck of it, Alizarin Crimson. Let's do that one. Now all of my paints here in this palette are pretty much all hard, and you use water on the hardness to pull out what you want here. So if I touch this, you can see how it's behaving. And this is an amazing thing for it to happen when you want to. So you just need to understand what kind of environment that you're creating in order for you to get the effect you want. Now, for most cases, you won't want it that wet. So you take a tissue, you dry your brush, and then pick up what's left after a few minutes. And this isn't the normal brush I use for this kind of thing. I just use a flat plain old paint brush. And now a lot of it depends on how much water you have on your brush too. So you can use the same color with a lot of water on your brush and get something similar, but with a little more control and a lot less carry. So it will carry, but it won't carry as much as that did. But now, on the other hand, and it's still pretty wet, on the other hand, if I take the color, the water, just a little water on the brush, I've got a lot more control. So I can, mix or whatever. And a lot of it depends on how much paint you have that you've pulled off the palette as well. So, it just really depends on how you work with it in the environment. So if you pull out paint and it's like a cream consistency versus, water consistency, it's going to behave differently. So you're not going to, the more water, the more it's going to be transparent, and it will always dry lighter than it shows. So you can count on that. Now, if I take some old paint, see, it doesn't matter if it's old or new. So you never have to waste paint. There it works. So you never have to worry about paint drying. Now, sometimes you want to clean your palette off for different projects because you want room to mix and stuff like that. But here's another technique. So again, this is the same technique we used on the wet on dry, but it's going to travel a little bit more now because it's on cold press. On this corner here. And a lot of times you don't need a whole lot of paint to put at least a little color, because see, sometimes you just want to paint the air, the feel of the air, and so you don't need a lot of paint. And you also need to remember as well, if you're going to be painting when you're upset, the water will react differently than if you were really joyful about something or you were really happy that day or whatever, because you got to remember, emotions are energy and you're pushing them out, and it will actually affect the water and pigment and stuff. So I've noticed that the behavior of my painting is different if I'm upset versus I'm happy or totally at peace or whatever. So, I mean, you can tell there's even here that I didn't have very much paint at all on my paintbrush, and it still is part of this painting. So, you just got to know where to save your whites and things like that. So that will kind of give you an overview. You can see here now the effects. So watercolor is all about layers and creating the environment that the paint and water work together in. So, it's not about you controlling paint. It's giving an opportunity for paint to live in a certain environment or flow into a certain environment, that kind of thing. So, if you're doing an eye, for example, on something, and there's a little glimmer, you just don't paint there. So like, for example, this white piece would be an example of something you would do in an eye on an animal or a human or whatever to save whites. You just wouldn't paint around it. So I hope this helps. It's not a fancy tutorial, but it give you an orientation. Now, if I was to do this on paper, now this is a pretty decent watercolor paper, but it's actually going to behave differently, and it has a tendency to lose pieces of the paper onto, but it's still better than a lot of papers, but it's going to buckle. I can see it already. I've just started and it's going to buckle. And if you work with it too much, the paper starts roughing out. So you really need to know what you're doing before you mess with paper, but it won't last and it will buckle very badly. So there's not, you just got to understand it's part of the environment. It's not a durable environment. And in cheaper papers, I just wouldn't even bother. And unless you just really don't care, unless you planning on not doing anything but with it. Now here's a thing that I ran into is I learned my lesson on paper even before I started watercolor. I never did portraits, and I started doing a portrait of a man that just touched I didn't even know this guy, and his face, his look of compassion was so ethereal that I had to draw him, and it was when I was doing more drawing than painting, and I started when he wasn't great at portraits. It turned out this portrait was pretty darn, and I finished it because it had no tooth and it had no durability. So if I had continued on it, it would have been shiny graphite look, which would have lost the realism. And so anyway, but yeah, this is buckling up. Another thing here also is, even if it's not completely dry, you can use a tissue and pick up paint. So for example, this is another one of those weirdo techniques. So I'm going to drop some paint here. It's not completely dried, so it won't be exactly perfect, but I'm going to let it sit there for about 10 seconds. And then I'm going to take this tissue and I'm going to lift it. So you can see it, but where the water You can't see it. Let me do it once, something a little more extreme. This, I'm not sure what you can see on the camera and versus what you can't. So I'm going to do it again. Let it sit there for a second. And then I'll lift it up. So if you make a mistake, you don't have to worry, because you can always do a technique scrubbing or lifting. So you can do that to lift, to lift water off. So I don't know if you can see it, but the paint is lifting off in a snake pattern. Oh, but anyway, you can do it. I don't think the camera's picking up because I'm such a subtle painter. They call me a high key painter, which is a lot of layers. And that's it. But see, normally what I will do to get a painting done is I will put my lights down in a very watery fashion to kind of block the painting out. And it's just the way it is. I mean, I just do it. And then I go back through and do the darks. And so here's another, I wanted to show you one more thing. Gradation. So anyway, it's like a watercolor, traditional watercolor is all layers. Totally all about layers. It's just the way it is. Just the way it is. So I'm gonna get some paint here. Use some of this that I've got on my palette. I'll even use several things here. And so, and a lot of times you might want to do this so you start out with paint at the top. And you just kind of work it down into the next areas until you have a gradation. Then you can use things like tissue to kind of give a fluffy effect. And I don't know if you can see that in my preview or not. So I'm going to do a little extreme area. It's blurring. Oh my gosh. Okay. So anyway, I'm sorry you can't see this very well, but let's hope it turns out in the actual finished video. Video. So anyway, there we have it. And you can see a lot of this other stuff is drying, and the effect that just putting a drop of water has on it. And light colors can be as vibrant or as pale as dark colors. I mean, this was made with a darker blue and water, so it just shows you that water is your white. So it's all about the tones you need, the tones and the hues, and creating that environment for it. So I'm trying to show you, but it's not working. You can't see it in that preview. So anyway, there you have it. I just thought I would try and help you out in giving you an idea of what can be done and how watercolor is actually used, and what can happen. But there you have it. I hope you create an amazing day. Bye-bye. See if I can get this. Stop.